In this video, I'm going to be discussing a bit of an intro to psychology in general and a little bit about its early history. And particularly, I want to focus on stimuli, stimulus, stimulation, and response. And they're all a bit different. And typically, when you're taking an introduction to psychology class, what you'll learn about first is about stimulus and response, which has an origin. Actually, all of them do: stimuli, stimulus, stimulation, and response all have an origin within the very first psychological science experiment that was conducted by Wilhelm Wundt. It has to do with reaction time, and particularly the experiment involved dropping a ball, an individual responding that through observation by pressing a button, and where a dinger went off. And that had to do with measuring a stimulus in the environment that has a potential as stimuli, and when it interacts with stimulation in our brain, so this midsection, we have a stimulus, which is the ball that's falling that we're observing, and that's at the same time stimulating aspects of the mind, which forms which is really important to this first experiment and first psychological science experiment, as well as the early foundations of a philosophy of science of psychology that has to do with parallelisms. A parallelism has to do with that stimuli and the pairing of the association of the stimulus and the response through stimulation that's occurring. So you have a parallel within what's occurring in the mind and what's occurring in the body or the environment, which is reflecting processes across the mind, body, and environment. And the body is very much acting as a membrane there between those through precepts. And I talked about that a little bit before. The precept is where our perception makes contact with the sensory aspects of our body, and which uh, is where the stimulation of the environment occurs. So we have stimulation coming in from the environment, it's stimulating those senses, and that's being transduced within a precept that directly influences perception and our subjective experiences, our self subjective experiences. And so that can elicit a response. In this case, it's reaction time that Wilhelm Wundt was primarily studying. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say for this video. I wanted to keep it short and just give you an introduction to stimuli, stimulus, stimulation, and response. Again, stimuli has to do with it's either going to be stimulating us or it could be passive and trivial, but it's an aspect within our psychological processes and perceptions that's there, that's more to do with these component processes and component parts of the environment, and particular what we hone in on with perception or not, which could be on the periphery. And then a stimulus is between that stimuli and stimulation, which is those components and phenomenon or objects that are stimuli potentials or actualizations that will stimulate various aspects of our psychology. And stimulations, what's going on in the mind and body directly, and often through this environmental pathway, or also the mind pathway or body pathway that initiates that. So you could think of psychological stimulation, or you can think of environmental stimulation, which requires psychological stimulation, or you can think of bodily stimulation and behavioral stimulation that's occurring. For example, physical activity is a prime example of that. You go for a run, that starts activating blood flow and increased arousal. Or if you're in terms of psychological stimulation, if you're reading something or writing something and you're thinking about it internally, that's psychologically stimulating. And if you go to a new environment and you see something in that environment, maybe it's a bright light or a fancy image of some sort, or something cool and novel that you find interesting, that's environmental stimulation, and that's going to impact our psychological processes. And that's just a brief overview of the early history and the basic fundamental rudiments of psychology. I hope you enjoy it. Bye.